Well, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of Let's Talk Housing San Jose. My name is Paul Pinninger. I work for a firm called Baird & Driscoll, and we've been staffing the Santa Clara County Housing Planning Collaborative over these past many months, and we're very delighted to welcome you to this meeting. Thank you for taking the time to talk about housing in San Jose. Before we get started, we wanted to say a few words about our interpretation services this evening. Para toda la gente que habla español, tenemos un servicio de interpretación al español. Pueden acceder al servicio al hacer clic en el botonito donde hay el globo. And now we're going to have a couple of words in Vietnamese.
Xin chào tất cả mọi người đã tới tham dự cuộc họp ngày hôm nay. Và trong cuộc họp ngày hôm nay chúng tôi sẽ có thông dịch bằng tiếng Việt Nam. Nếu mà quý vị xin click vào cái quả địa cầu ở bên màn hình phía bên tay phải để chọn một ngôn ngữ, đó là ngôn ngữ tiếng Việt, để được nghe thông dịch bằng tiếng Việt Nam. Cảm ơn quý vị rất nhiều.
Thank you for that. A few more Zoom logistics. We're going to have a lot of people joining us this evening. Thank you very much again for your time. We suggest that while you're joining the Zoom meeting, that if you can, that you press mute so that everybody can be heard when they do speak up. The way that you know that you're muted is that there's a red line through the unmute microphone on your Zoom panel. You can also click on participants to see who is in the meeting, and in some versions of Zoom, depending on whether you have a Mac or a PC, you can also give nonverbal feedback by pressing this participants button. To chat, and we're going to be asking you to chat some things over the course of the meeting. You can click on chat to enter your questions during the Q&A, and also to participate during our breakout sessions. And then finally, in some versions of chat, of Zoom, you can offer nonverbal reactions through emoticons by clicking on reactions. A few other meeting ground rules that we'd like to suggest. This is an introductory meeting. This is a beginning meeting. There'll be lots of other opportunities to talk about policy, housing policy of all types. There's no right or wrong answers. Everybody is encouraged to speak up, to offer their opinions and ideas in a respectful way. Everyone should have the time and opportunity to speak up and share their ideas over the course of the meeting. Please, no interruptions or disrespect of other speakers or other people who are participating in the meeting. And to the extent that you're able, please provide an equal chance to speak. That's something that the facilitators are going to be helping to make sure happens over the course of the meeting. We also wanted to introduce the City of San Jose team, who will be joining us this evening to help present housing trends in San Jose and a little bit more about the housing element. We have Jared Hart, Ruth Cueto, and David Ying from the Planning Department, and then Kristen Clements, John Ishimatsu, Elizabeth Guzman, and Lori Severino from the Housing Department. For more information, and we will post this in the chat, please access the City of San Jose's website at the URL that you have on your screen, or you can send an email to housingelement@sanjoseca.gov for more information. So there's lots of ways for you to get involved and to learn more about the housing element in San Jose. Our agenda is pretty straightforward. After this brief welcome session, we're going to talk a bit about what a housing element is, the status of housing in San Jose. Very importantly, we're going to have breakout sessions where you can divide up into several breakout sessions. We have at least 8 planned, including one in Spanish and one in Vietnamese. And you can ask your questions, chat your concerns, and also hear from each other about housing. We'll then talk about what's next in the process and additional opportunities for you to be involved in learning more about the housing element and housing policy in San Jose. So why are we here and what is Let's Talk Housing? The purpose of this meeting, as I said at the introduction, is to provide an introductory overview of the housing element, which is a critical part of San Jose's general plan, to describe what the housing element is, how it gets updated, and how you can get involved in influencing the priorities that get included in the housing element. This is all part of a county-wide effort called Let's Talk Housing. And Let's Talk Housing is really an outgrowth of a collaborative of all of the jurisdictions in Santa Clara County and the county itself, and that includes the City of San Jose. And it's an effort outside of normal city and county processes to provide a forum for talking about housing, for sharing innovations in planning and housing ideas, and providing a space outside of an advocacy organization or public sector meeting space to talk about housing ideas. It's nonpartisan, it's objective. We don't take policy positions. So we're going to learn more about what a housing element is, what fair housing is. I'm going to talk about some housing trends, also learn more about outreach and decision-making processes in San Jose. And then you'll have an opportunity to share your thoughts and ideas about housing needs, the biggest housing issues or challenges that you observe or experience in San Jose. And then very importantly, your goals or vision for what you'd like to see housing be in San Jose over the next 10 years. I'm now going to turn it over to Ruth Cueto of the City of San Jose, who's going to share a little bit more about what a housing element is before going into some trends and data describing housing in the city.
Thank you, Paul. So what exactly is a housing element? It's part of the city's general plan, which includes many policies for guiding growth and managing the changes that go along with it, with the intent of improving quality of life over time. It is basically a local housing plan for the homes needed in every community. While local governments do not build housing, they do create the rules that shape where housing can be built, what types, and how much. The housing element includes policies and programs that address housing needs for all types of households, including those with special needs or at different income levels, and solutions like how to preserve existing housing, particularly affordable housing. California state law requires that every city, town, and county update their housing element about every 8 years. The last completed cycle was for 2014 to 2023, and this update will guide the housing in our city from 2023 to 2031. Next slide.
Yes.
Thank you. There are several parts to a housing element, including several studies and analyses like the housing that is here now and what housing is needed, any constraints or issues that will make housing in certain areas hard to develop, identifying sites where it is possible to add new housing, the review of goals, policies, and programs, and figuring out new ones. There will also be new considerations for fair housing laws to address discrimination and segregation in housing. Also, the state requires that housing elements engage community members in discussing housing needs so that the final plan reflects and responds to community concerns and priorities. I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Josh.
As Ruth said, fair housing is a part of the housing element. So a little bit about fair housing. Fair housing is about preventing discrimination in housing. And it is also about actively creating opportunity, about addressing patterns of discrimination, history of segregation, about fostering inclusive communities. Fair housing is a both and approach, where we remove barriers for people to live where they choose and where we increase investment in underserved communities. A parallel to the housing element process, the city's housing department is producing an assessment of fair housing plan that documents barriers to housing and identifies strategies to help. This plan will be closely related to the housing element and on the same timeline. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So fair housing laws apply to types of people that are protected under fair housing laws called protected classes. On the left, there are classes of people protected under the federal fair housing laws. So that's race, ethnicity, religion, etc. And on the right column is the state of California protected classes, which is everything covered by federal law and additional categories of gender identity expression, sexual orientation, marital status, age, veteran status, etc. The housing elements analysis should have a particular focus on how the housing market serves all of these populations. Next slide, and then Lori.
sorry. Next slide, Josh.
So, okay. I actually, these are,
Sorry, I was just gonna say it's the wrong slide. It's actually the process slide that's next.
but
So you want me to go forward here?
yeah, it's
Yeah.
actually,
There we go. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Lori. So as Josh mentioned, we are working on the housing element update and assessment of fair housing in parallel, and we plan to take both to council for consideration in late 2022. The joint process will involve multiple rounds of outreach and community engagement to involve the public in preparing the documents. Each round will be aligned with a major milestone shown on the bottom of this slide. We are building upon previous fair housing work and related efforts, but round one of the coordinated process begins with this kickoff meeting and focuses on housing needs and goals. Round two will focus on draft analyses and strategies and is planned to occur in early 2022. Round three will involve public review of the complete draft documents before going through the public hearing process as part of round four. Each round will offer multiple ways to participate, and we will report back on the input received in the previous rounds. We encourage you to visit the project website for current information and to sign up for email updates about engagement opportunities. So next slide, but I think that means going back.
Yeah, so what we're going to do now, and apologies for the confusion there, is that we're going to take some questions since we presented a lot of information about the housing element and about the housing element process, and give you a chance to ask questions to city staff and to us as your facilitators about the housing element. You can put them in the chat, and my colleague Joshua Abrams will help to moderate and facilitate these questions. We realize that probably we won't get a chance to answer all of the questions since there's so many participants, but there will be more opportunities for you to get your questions answered going forward. So do folks have any questions about what we've presented, about what a housing element is and what the process is?
Oh, if you could put that question in the chat, it's a little easier for us to manage questions if we can get them in the chat, please. Thanks.
What did you want me to put in the chat?
Paul Soto, somebody in the audience.
Oh, okay.
Paul Penninger, your job is to answer them. Well,
Yeah.
we'll just.
I could ask myself questions.
Well, we might do that, but hopefully we'll get some. So the first question I see is, how is the citing policy related to the housing element? I wonder if someone on the staff, San Jose staff, wants to answer that, and maybe just say a brief word about the citing policy for those who don't know what it is.
Could take that question. Hi, I'm Kristen Clements. I'm with the Housing Department. The citing policy is a policy on where we would cite affordable housing that the city generally funds or supports in some way. And it is based on the premise that we need to work on fair housing, meaning access to all kinds of areas of the city and opportunities for the people that live in affordable housing. The City Council actually just approved the citing policy a few days ago. And so implementation of the citing policy might end up being one of the strategies in the housing element, but it is something that actually is ahead of it in terms of the timeline for implementation. So it has its own implementation timeline at this point. Hopefully that helps.
Great. And then, well, we'll just do one quick follow-up to that one. What do you mean, Kristen, when you talk about citing housing?
When I say citing housing, it's where is it going to be located? And so what we found is there is a very large mismatch between where the majority of people were living and where the majority of affordable housing developments were being located.
Good. And right, and these are housing units that are affordable, so the city's putting in some funding so the city has a say in them, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Okay, well, a mechanics question. Who's involved in creating the housing element? Is it going to be city staff or an outside company?
Answer that question. It will be city staff that does the analysis. We will be working with some consultants to help us with the site inventory. And we may also work with a consultant to help us draft, like, I think it's one of the Adobe suites, just so that it's a nice looking document. Essentially, that's where what they would be helping us with.
Great. Okay. There's two related questions here about how policies get into the housing element. So specifically, the two questions are: who will make the final decision about housing units in a single-family neighborhood? And does the housing element include things like Second Street complex? If so, how are they reviewed for success? So generally, who decides what goes in the housing element, who approves it, and what type of policies and programs are in the document?
So I'm trying to look for the question, but I think in terms of policies and programs, this is one of many meetings that we intend to have with the community. We will have other opportunities where we gather, determine the housing needs based on community input. There will also be focus groups. The housing element require us to do specific outreach to a very specific populations, as was noted in one of the slides that Joshua talked about. So we would be seeking input from the community, help in developing these recommendations. And was there a third part to that, Josh?
No.
Oh, who approves it? Was that
who ultimately decides?
Yeah, the final decision maker will be the city council.
Great. And I think there's a lot of questions about how this plan works with other city plans. How does it coincide or overlap with the 2040 plan?
I think you said 2040 general plan. So this is one of the elements or sections of a general plan. It's required for all cities to include a housing element within their general plan. It's a little bit different because this one is updated every 8 years, where our general plan is, I think, a 30-year document. So it does have to align with the policies that are currently in place within the general plan.
Great. Paul, do we have more time or?
Yeah, I think we should take a couple of more questions. These are good. There's a lot of interest.
Okay. Let's see. Well, this is a good challenge. This is a question about challenges. Why haven't the transit-oriented communities gotten off the ground? I think that's a good opportunity to talk about what the city controls and what it doesn't, and what's its role in promoting housing. Does someone at the city staff want to do that? Or I can talk more broadly about the
Someone said that I should take this question, but I did not hear the question.
It was about why the challenges with getting transit-oriented communities off the ground, and generally I was expanding a little bit to be just generally the city's role in promoting housing when the city obviously doesn't build housing.
Right. So the city plans for the housing and sort of comes up with a framework of where it should go. As part of the housing element, one of the things that we need to do is to identify governmental constraints or barriers to housing and look at strategies to address them to facilitate housing. Some of the challenges that we've had in the last, I would say, 5-6 years with building transit-oriented communities and housing in general has been the cost of construction, and more recently the cost of materials, which is so high now that even though the rents are exorbitant, they're not high enough to compensate for the cost of construction in San Jose. So that's kind of a phenomenon that we unfortunately don't have a lot of control of.
Great. Maybe we'll do one more question and then we'll move on. And I see a couple of questions. I'll just make a comment. There's a couple of questions about how will the city, with many thousands of Silicon Valley workers living in garages and 15 workers to a single family home, how do you plan to fix this? And there's a number of questions like that. And I'll just say that's the point of the housing element, to identify what strategies, what tools, what programs to put in place to address all the problems. Obviously, it starts with identifying the problems. That's where more what we'll be talking about today. But it's definitely, if you have strategies, you should mention them. The staff and other people will all put in strategies. And the goal of the housing element is to really get as many people in safe, affordable housing as possible. So that's why we're here to listen with things like with your ideas. And then we'll do one more, and it's about the intersection of SB 9 and the housing element. Assuming SB 9 is signed by the governor, which gives homeowners the right to do duplexes or split their lots in some cases. Does someone want to talk about how that'll be incorporated in the housing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it, frankly, we have to think about that. I don't think it really would be. I mean, that would be something that, if the governor signs that bill, we would just need to be doing. And there's a whole bunch of things that we need to do: change our zoning ordinance, develop design standards to do that work. So, I mean, yeah, it's just something that I think it would be something that we acknowledge, but I don't know. It'd be a strategy that the state is saying you have to do, basically. So I think it's more or less a separate thing that we have to deal with separately from this process.
Okay. I'm going to pause questions so we can keep going on. I'll just also say, I'm going to turn off the chat. You're still welcome to, if you have important messages you want to send to the hosts or co-hosts, we will, of course, you're welcome, always welcome to do that. But just because it can be distracting, and just because other meetings, I don't want to say what happened in this meeting, but it's sometimes people have posted inappropriate things in the chat. And so when we're ready for feedback, we'll turn that chat back on. But when we're not looking for feedback, we're gonna keep the chat closed, or just set to email hosts and co-hosts.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for those great questions. There's so many more, and there's lots of opportunities for us to talk more about these issues and others in the breakout rooms and in future meetings. We now want to ask a little bit more about who is in the room, so we can understand who's with us this evening, and also importantly, who's not with us, so we can do more outreach and more inclusive outreach going forward. So we're now going to launch a poll, and there are 7 questions in the poll that we'd like you to answer. We'll take a couple of minutes to let you answer those, and then we'll continue on with the presentation on some additional housing trends in San Jose, picking up where we left off.
And I'm just going to do a disclaimer. Zoom, since they updated the polls, have been really swirly, and sometimes they close. I promise you, we're not closing it early. If Zoom if there's a quirk and it closes it, we'll relaunch it, assuming people didn't get a chance. And we apologize. We've talked to them, and there's nothing we can do at this point. Hopefully, it won't happen today, but I promise you, we're not closing it early.
Yeah, this is not a speed test, so take your time answering the questions.
Thanks to those who are already answering. Please answer if you haven't. It helps us make sure we're really reaching the whole population.
Great, over half of everybody has already responded.
More than half. We're almost at 60 of the 83.
Okay, let's take just a few more seconds for folks to finish up.
Yeah.
Great. Hey, Josh, I think we should probably move on from this.
Okay.
All right, thank you everybody who participated in the poll. We appreciate it. We're now going to talk a little bit more about some of San Jose's housing challenges before we move on to breaking up into breakout sessions for more in-depth Q&A and discussion. And I think that's you, Ruth.
No, it's
Actually, this is
me,
Josh.
sorry.
That's or Josh.
So,
Hyde.
yeah.
Thank
So
you.
we know that there are multiple housing related issues that we face as residents of the Bay Area. From feedback from the community and other forums, from living in the community ourselves, from data and other forms of evidence, we want to acknowledge that these challenges exist and have huge negative impacts on the quality of our lives. Spending too much on mortgage or rent means that some might lose their housing if their pay decreases, and they're left to couch surf or live in cars or camp where they should not have to live. Our difficult housing market is causing longtime San Jose residents to be displaced from their homes, from their communities. Some people have to move out of the area entirely, leaving a place that has been their home for generations. Studies show this leads to especially damaging effects for low-income residents. Barriers to accessing good quality housing also cause people to live in overcrowded conditions with families doubled and tripled up in apartments that are supposed to have far fewer people. And all of these issues are challenges in our housing market. And of course, COVID layered on top of all of our pre-existing conditions has made everything worse, especially for those who are already the most vulnerable. The city intends to address all of these types of housing issues as much as we can through the housing element, but we won't be able to solve everything. As Ruth said, as Michael said, the city sets the framework, the zoning and policy environment for things to happen through private and nonprofit sectors. Next slide, please. So, I mean, I just want to, go a little bit deeper on a couple of these issues. So, first off, San Jose used to be affordable. In the left-hand column over here is the value of, in 1970, what rent was in San Jose, what the median home value was in San Jose. And if the second column are those numbers if they were brought up to $20, $21 just by inflation. And the 2021 actual value is in the last column. So you can see that, rents went up by over double in real dollars, and, 8 times as much, over 8 times as much in terms of housing. And like, what I'm, In 1970, my mother, a single mother, was able to afford a house for a little bit less than $30,000 in the Strawberry Park neighborhood of West San Jose. She was a nurse at Valley Medical Center, and she still lives in that house. The equivalent price, of that house in inflated dollars would be less than $200,000, and now it's almost 10 times as worth 10 times. Next slide, please. So just that opportunity that my mother had is no longer available in our region. Our region is one of the most expensive places to live in the entire country. This list is about single home sales, but we all know that San Jose is also an expensive place to rent. Next slide, please. So many essential workers, people who our economy, our society cannot function without, can't afford to live in San Jose. So the vertical blue bars show income by different job types. It may be a little bit small and hard to read, but we have, it's like the healthcare workers, janitors, construction workers, and the horizontal lines, the different colored lines, show how much you'd have to make to rent or buy medium-priced homes in San Jose. This assumes that a household will have to spend a reasonable 30% of their gross income on housing, which is a fairly common rule of thumb. We know that many people spend far more than that 30% just in order to live here. And you can see the bottom blue line, median rent for a one-bedroom apartment is unaffordable for many full-time workers. Households need to have 2 or 3 wage earners just to share a one-bedroom apartment, and even more for a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment. And home ownership, sort of the top 2 lines, is out of reach for the majority of residents here, especially when you factor in how hard it is to save for a down payment while having to pay these high rents. Next slide, please. So actually, I'm going to pass this to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Josh. So this slide illustrates the percentage of population at each income level. So looking at the left-hand bar for San Jose, from the bottom going up, that is extremely low income, very low income, and low income. So if you add those up, 41.2% of San Jose's population is low income and below. So the residents in these blue, green, and teal bars are usually the focus for rental housing strategies. And the yellow strip and a little bit of the dark blue represent moderate income residents. So the yellow strip down to the blue, so that's moderate income down to extremely low income, are the affordable housing categories that the housing element needs to provide for. So in San Jose, this is a large amount of people. It's over half of our population that qualifies for affordable housing. This is a greater share of our population than the counties, which is in the middle, and the whole Bay Area, which is the right set of bars. So giving these incomes a bit more context, know that they are adjusted by household size. So for example, in 2021, a family of 4 earning $49,700 would be considered extremely low income. If that same family of 4 made up to $117,750, they'd be considered low income. And if they could make it up to $181,550, they'd be considered moderate income. Next slide, please. So this slide has some quotes from a working group, a report on displacement that the city released last year together with 2 nonprofits based in San Jose. People there are speaking about some of the impacts that they've experienced in their lives and their communities when residents can't afford to live here. And we've talked about it a bit earlier tonight, and I saw some of these, this discussed in feedback earlier. So, I mean, it just goes back to the high housing costs leads to overcrowding, where people have to live with maybe more roommates or family members than the home is designed to hold, or so they can keep costs realistic. This can also mean people stay in unsafe or unhealthy living conditions because they have no other options. When workers we depend on have to move to find more affordable rents and home prices, studies show that their commutes generally increase. And even if the move is relatively local, their health is hurt from the stress and the longer commutes, so their time with their family suffers. And this disruption can also hurt children's educational outcomes. More commuting increases traffic. Obviously, that's bad for everybody. Longer commutes by car increase carbon emissions. And sometimes people can no longer make the direct and indirect costs of traveling far for work pencil out, and they just end up having to leave their communities for good. So when that happens, our communities lose part of its culture, what makes San Jose unique. Families and friends get split apart, and also can create worker turnover increases. So in sum, we all lose when we can't plan adequately for housing. I'm going to pass it back to Josh.
So next slide, please. So as I said earlier, fair housing laws require cities to address conditions of segregation. Some housing challenges affect some types of people more than others, and this can result in and is reinforced by segregated living patterns. Our city, like most others in the US, has a distinct pattern of segregation by race and socioeconomic status. On this map, each dot represents 75 persons. Orange dots are non-Hispanic white residents. Purple dots are Asian and Pacific Islanders. Blue are Latino-Latina households. Orange dots with some purple are concentrated in the West and South, blue and purple in the East. With the dot map, you can clearly see that there are strong divisions of where people live on the basis of race and ethnicity. Next slide, please. So just to take a brief step back and acknowledge that segregation by race and socioeconomic status has multiple causes. Some are historic and some are still very much ongoing. Some have to do with public institutions, government at all levels, and some have to do about private institutions like banks. Before the Fair Housing Act of 1968, some housing policies were explicitly racist, such as redlining and restrictive covenants. With changes in laws, racism in policy became
and sit down and meet
implicit,
in her
not
office.
just in housing, but in many ways. Now policies often have unintended consequences, meaning that even though there is no racial motivation, the policy can still cause or perpetuate racial disparities. Segregation is a systemic society-wide problem with many negative side effects to individuals, communities, and to our city. The city had a role to play in creating this problem, and we have a responsibility to address it. The problem cannot be solved by the housing element in and of itself, as we've mentioned before, but is a problem that we intend to address through the housing element and through other related city efforts. Next slide, please, and I'll pass it to Ruth.
Thank you. So one part of the housing element is how we plan for our regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA. It's a goal for housing production that's required by state law, and local governments get their housing allocation through a very long process. The California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, calculates a total based on several factors like jobs, economic growth, unmet housing needs, and population. The Association of Bay Area Governments, or ABAG, then decides on a methodology that identifies the share for each city, town, and county after a lengthy process, taking into account their size, number of jobs, regional growth projections, and other factors. San Jose staff sat on a regional committee to help determine the methodology used for the RHNA allocations. This cycle is different from previous cycles in that it also sets goals to help address overcrowding and other housing problems in each market. This table shows San Jose's allocation for the current cycle, cycle 5, and the upcoming cycle 6 that we are planning for. You can see that San Jose's cycle 6 is higher, and we actually got a considerably lower percentage increase than some of the other nearby cities did. While the allocation focuses more growth to the South Bay, the methodologies focus on high access to opportunity areas and job proximity means San Jose receives fewer homes than other cities in the South Bay. And just a point of clarification, the row that references very low income, it also includes our requirements for extremely low income. It's just not pulled out in this chart. Next slide. We've talked about state law and requirement for cities to plan for housing and the challenges that we face as a city. But we also want to briefly highlight a few different housing initiatives currently underway that are outside of the housing element update process. The Housing Crisis Work Plan was approved by Council in June 2018 and includes strategies and policy actions to help create 25,000 new housing units by 2023. And this goal includes 10,000 affordable housing units. In September 2020, the City Council approved the citywide residential anti-displacement strategy, a set of 10 policy proposals focused on production, preservation, and tenant protection. Staff is developing 5 of the strategies right now, while the other 5 are to come over the next few years. In June 2021, the City Council approved staff's initial findings and analysis in the assessment of fair housing. And this past Tuesday, Council adopted staff's affordable housing siting policy, which guides where affordable apartments should be built to maximize the health and welfare of residents. Currently, the city is undergoing a general plan 4-year review, looking at several strategies to improve housing production. As part of this process, staff is evaluating the concept of opportunity housing, which would slightly increase density in our single-family focused city. Opportunity housing would integrate 2 to 4 unit homes into single-family areas. That policy work is going to be presented to the Planning Commission in November and City Council in December to see if it should move forward to the next phase of study.
Great, thank you, City of San Jose staff, for that excellent presentation of trends and issues. We'd now like you, before we go and break up into several small groups to talk about in greater depth some of San Jose's housing needs and your vision for the future, we'd now like you to put in the chat a word that describes the kind of housing you envision for the future in San Jose. So looking forward to 2030, and thinking that the housing element was adopted and implemented, what kind of housing would you like to see in the future in San Jose? What word or words would you use to describe that? And we'll reflect that back to you at the end of the meeting in the form of a word cloud, so you can see what words really rose to the top in terms of people's ideas or vision for the future. What word describes the kind of housing you envision for the future? Thank you, everybody.
And please make sure to send your word to everyone in the room and not just one particular host or co-host.
As much as we love your ideas. Yeah. If you could send it to everyone, that's great. Thank you very much. So while we're getting people's ideas about what word describes the kind of housing you envision for the future, we wanted to just set forth again our meeting ground rules that we're going to take with us into the breakout rooms. And that is that we want to hear from everybody. There are no right or wrong answers at this point. Everyone should have the time and opportunity to speak and share their ideas. Please, no interruptions or disrespect of other speakers. And to the extent that you're able, please provide an equal chance to speak. If you're someone who speaks a lot, perhaps think about stepping back a bit. If you're someone who doesn't speak a lot or who is a little bit more reticent to speak in public meetings, please feel free to step forward and to share your ideas or to ask your questions. We're going to break up into several different breakout rooms, and we're going to ask 4 basic questions of each group. What housing challenges do you experience or observe in San Jose? What do you think are the most pressing housing needs? How can we make sure to hear from our entire community as part of the housing element update process? And then we're going to talk about in greater depth what words or ideas do you have about housing in your community now and goals for the future. So we're going to now break up into several breakout rooms. You'll be assigned to a breakout room with a facilitator and a note taker. And we're looking forward to seeing you back here in the main room at 7:25. So thank you, everybody. Hi. Hello, everybody. Thank you. I know our small group session was really productive. I hope everybody had a great discussion. Thank you again for attending this evening and taking the time out of your busy schedules. We did have planned a word cloud to show in a word cloud format.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Put up.
No worries. Somebody just forgot to mute themselves.
And Daisy and Corinne, I'm not sure where that final word
Yeah,
cloud is.
I can share my screen. Give me just 1 second.
Okay.
And if Corinne, if you could share the feedback survey link that is in the run of show, that would be great while I show this word aloud.
Thank you, Daisy and Corinne. So in the
Yeah.
chat, we're going to share a survey. We would love your feedback if you're able. Great.
All right.
These are all great words. This is what words describe the kind of housing you envision in the future. And right at the center is affordable. We also have equitable, plentiful, safe, urban village, thought out, really, really inspiring word cloud. And
decommodified.
Decommodified. Yeah, lots of other good
One
words.
I wanted to vote on, but I agree with
Great.
that.
So thank you for all your ideas. In the chat, we've just posted the survey. Please do, if you have a chance, fill out the survey, provide us with feedback about this meeting. There will be lots of other opportunities for you to get engaged in San Jose around the housing element update. And hopefully we'll see you at future meetings and other engagement efforts. And so we really appreciate your time and all of your thoughtful comments this evening. And thank you for putting up with our Zoom technological issues.
Thank you all for your patience and for joining tonight.